graduate college. The department named the lectureship after him. And over the years, we've had some distinguished speakers. Benjamin Page from Northwestern, Ted Gurr from Maryland, Michael Gant from Tennessee. I don't know if he was still there.
Oh, yes.
And we've had some less well-known, but from our own area, Tom Chadwick from Davis and Elkins, Horace Bartolo, and Matthew Gable, right? Mm-hmm. From UK, Mike Variety from, some of you in 105 might be familiar with that name, from Berea, and of course Chuck Smith, and the other Dr. Beller, Gerald Beller from West Virginia State. Mostly it's been academics, but occasionally we get people involved in the hurly-burly politics. Governor Underwood spoke one year, and Joe Johns, and so, you know, we've had a pretty good crew coming in and enlightening us about politics. And we're in for a special treat today. Mikel Norris got his master's here at Marshall, and then went on to a PhD program at University of Tennessee, and now teaches. I don't know, everybody here is from West Virginia, I figure, so you know the traffic jam on the way to Myrtle Beach. That's Conway. It's where Coastal Carolina University is.
Right next to that traffic jam, literally.
Yep. And so now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. My discussion today is entitled Madam Chief Justice, Gendered Leadership on State Supreme Courts. Today I'm going to talk about one piece of fruit from what's proving to be a very fruitful tree of research. An idea that was slightly born while I was at Marshall and then began to grow as I went through my program in Tennessee. And with a little kick in the rear from some friends in Coastal Carolina, we've decided to move forward with this project, and as I said, it's proven to be very fruitful. What we're looking at here is women who are chief justices on state Supreme Courts. And why is this idea important? Get this to work here. When you study gender and politics in particular, there's always the same statement made over and over and over again. There are no women in positions of leadership in American politics. Why don't we have women here, and why don't we have women there? That's true. It's very true. It was President Obama's mission to, for example, to diversify more than had been done before the United States Supreme Court. There's often talk about the fact that there are no women senators, or not as many as there had been, or women in the House of Representatives. All levels of state and local government, there are no women in positions of leadership. But that's not entirely true. There is one position where women have actually been very successful in getting a position of leadership, and that is in state Supreme Courts. At state Supreme Courts, women have been very successful at achieving the position of Chief Justice in these courts. Now, to be fair, I've had to highlight this. When we started this project, over half of the states had women Chief Justices, 26. Today, we're down to 16. I don't know what's happened. Again, another idea for future research. But for today, we have 16. But in the past, we've had over half of the states with women as Chief Justices. So while a lot of the literature and political science is saying we don't have enough women in positions of leadership, that is true in lots of other positions, but in state Supreme Courts, that is not. So to give you an idea of where women are Chief Justices today, we see a lot here, and the states in green are the ones with women Chief Justices. Out on the West Coast, we have some. Colorado, New Mexico. Here in the Midwest, we see quite a few. Tennessee, Louisiana, the Northeast. Some states where it has passed, where I'm from in South Carolina, we had We had a female Chief Justice who had stepped down just a year or two ago. Where else? Oregon, Iowa, up in the Northeast, and actually in the South, we've had several. Georgia, for example, they actually had an African-American female Chief Justice who was stepped down about a year or two ago. Florida. Other states have had them. Currently, this is the composition, but this is not, I guess the point I would try to make is that it's not just these states in green that have had female Chief Justices. Most of the states in the United States have had a female Chief Justice at some point in time. So the real impetus of this is why? Why are women likely to fill this position of leadership? What's going on? How come women aren't getting into positions of other positions of politics? Elected positions might be the best case scenario. Why are women more likely to fill this position of leadership? But that's not just the only question here. Once, trying to figure out why they get there. Are they chosen because of particular leadership skills? The men and women who are Chief Justices, they are leaders of their courts, as I'll talk about in a second. But leading a court is not the same as being a committee chairman in a state legislature or being governor of a state. There are certain skills that are necessary for that. And as I will talk about, there is a very robust literature, not just in political science, but in psychology and in business, organizational behavior, and in sociology about the different characteristics of leadership of women in positions not just in government but in the private sector as well. Are these particular skills amenable to being Chief Justice? Meaning, are these skills that are actively sought out to lead these courts? Or are the questions more mundane? Are these women chosen as token selections to these positions? As I will talk about in much of the literature on descriptive and substantive representation, women are often sometimes chosen for these positions not because of any inherent skill, but because it looks good. The token representative. I don't know if any of you watch South Park and Token on South Park. Why is his name Token? There's a point there. He's the token African American on the show. It's the same idea. And there's a literature in political science on courts where women are chosen for token positions, for purposes of legitimacy or for what have you. Are they chosen for this position as well? And then finally, I'll talk about this as well, are they merely the benefactors of time and place? Is this nothing more than the slow march of time? The mundane probability that as more women become justices on state Supreme Courts, it's just as likely that they'll become Chief Justices of their state Supreme Courts, as I'll talk about as well. This isn't like the United States Supreme Court, where we nominate and confirm one individual to be Chief Justice, and then that person serves for as long as he and someday she decides to. This is in most states a rotating position. The men and women who serve in this get put under their position through different means. They serve different terms. There are different people who have served and then have stepped down and have served as associate justices. And 3, 4, 5 years later, they serve again. Is this merely just the fact that these the women who served in this position, they're just the beneficiaries of time and place? These are just some of the questions that in this presentation, which is based off of one paper I'm working on, is answered here, but other papers down the line I would hope to address as well. So, this is not Scooby-Doo, so I'm not going to save the grand conclusion and pull the mask off at the very end. What are we finding overall in our research analysis in this paper and beyond? Well, first of all, we find that that the leadership skills that are usually attributed to women in positions of leadership are, in fact, in high demand in state Supreme Courts. The organization of a state Supreme Court is amenable to that. The skills that are desired of Chief Justices are usually the skills that are attributed to women and their leadership styles. However, we find that these skills are only partially considered when a person is chosen to be Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court. And maybe more importantly, and there's many different ways in which you can interpret this, what we find is that many women are selected to be Chief Justices merely because they are women. And you can take this to maybe be a good thing, but also to maybe be a bad thing. On the one hand, you could say that that's very close to fulfilling that token role that I talked about earlier. But what we see is that in the states where women are likely to be chosen as Chief Justice, it's because these states and their political cultures and climates, they're conducive to diversity. Women have more success in getting positions of power in general in those states and are more represented in government. And related to that, in those state Supreme Courts, there are more women in those state Supreme Courts. So there's a greater supply, or as we will call our supply side theory of selection. The supply of women in the state Supreme Courts is greater. So they have a greater likelihood of being chosen as Chief Justice. So, to go through kind of the literature on this topic, to begin with, we wanted to talk about, when writing this paper, about the power of Chief Justices. This in and of itself is an understudied topic at the state level. There is a wealth of research about the United States Supreme Court Chief Justice, and a lot of the state literature piggybacks off of this. But the argument is that or a misconception is that while the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court is a powerful person, state Chief Justices are not. Well, that is not very true. Chief Justices on state Supreme Courts, like the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, sets the agenda for the states. Like the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, they are often tasked with promoting consensus on their court. These justices in the states, just like on the United States Supreme Court, don't always get along. They have to arrive at conclusions. They have to keep a civil atmosphere in which they get their work done, and the Chief Justice is often burdened with the task of generating and promoting consensus on their court. One very important goal that we will see that differs across states is the power of opinion assignment. This is commonly seen as the most important power that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court has. As we will see at the state level, some states grant their Chief Justice this power, and others do not. This is a very important power in studying Chief Justices, because the ability to assign who gets to write opinions and often will determine the outcome or the legal outcome in a particular case. Not just in the number of yeses and nos, but the extremities to which the case will be decided. And Chief Justices also perform what the literature calls institutional maintenance. They don't just decide cases. The Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court, like the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, is the face of the state court system. They have to secure funding from the legislature. They often have to go up in front of the state legislatures every year and justify why they need so many dollars to do X, Y, and Z. That is their job. That is part of the job description. In this way, they are the mouthpiece of state courts. And related to that, because they are the mouthpiece and because they have to do this, they are usually burdened with the task of providing the face of legitimacy to the public in the states. They have to help build, through their actions, build public confidence in the courts. One of the overarching goals of the courts, and what we try to do, is to say that, look, our courts are not political branches. They are a political branch, but they are apolitical. And most people know that that's not true, but at times they have to say, look, we are apolitical. We do make judicial decisions, and they have to build confidence in the courts. The biggest argument as to why for example, at the Supreme Court level, why Chief Justice Roberts sided with the majority to uphold the Affordable Care Act wasn't because he had an ideological proclivity for supporting that law. He probably hates it. But many have argued, and I agree with it, is that he is looking out for the interests and the legitimacy of the Supreme Court first. That takes priority over ideological positions. And state Supreme Court justices often have to do this as well. So their powers are non-trivial. And the literature on the United States Supreme Court also shows what kinds of skills the Chief Justice should have. And there's a good literature on this. They break different leadership skills into two types that are useful for a Chief Justice to have. Task leadership and social leadership. What is task leadership? Really, it's the ability of the Chief Justice to frame cases and to clear the court's docket. This really has to do with the administration of the court. Get the cases processed. Make sure that the work of the court is getting done, that they're not falling behind, that they're keeping up with their agenda. The second task is called social leadership, and this is the job of the Chief Justice to alleviate the strains inherent in the collegial relationship of justices on the court. During these cases, some of which are very mundane, but some of them can get very, very political and very ideologically charged, they have to keep everybody's heads cool. They have to build consensus. They have to calm disputes and make sure that everybody is willing and able to work with one another. And the literature on the Chief Justice says that the good Chief Justices will have these skills. So, for example, at the United States Supreme Court, they often point to the demise of consensual norms on the United States Supreme Court to Harlan Stone's Chief Justiceship in the 1940s. So they said he lacked both of these leadership qualities. And because he lacked them, the Supreme Court, for lack of a better term, fell apart. He had no leadership skills. He wouldn't get things processed on time. He had a lot of freewheeling kind of what he called debate, but it was really just argument to go, and he wouldn't try to build consensus. And it led to the court fairly ripping itself in two through that period. And many say that that has continued. Other Chief Justices, for example, William Rehnquist, they say he was great at task leadership. He was always keeping the trains running on time, so to speak. He was a great administrator, but he did not care for social leadership. While he was very socially amenable, was very friendly, and everybody in the court recognized how amicable he was and friendly, he was not interested in building consensus. He was very ideological in his beliefs on the court and was not shy about expressing them. That doesn't necessarily mean he was a bad Chief Justice. It's the study of Chief Justices from these positions of leadership are often used. Another point that is often brought up is that Chief Justices, if they are going to be successful as leaders, they have to have a very good understanding of the political environment in which they are operating. Again, going back to Chief Justice Roberts, one of his greatest attributes, I would say, as a Chief Justice so far, is that he has a very good sense of the politics of the times. And more importantly, where the Supreme Court fits into that politics of the times. When the court can move in one direction, when they can decide particular hot political cases one way and the country will be okay with it. But in other issues saying, all right, we need to back off, we need to step out of the limelight. It's the job of the courts. We're not supposed to be here. This needs to be settled by politics and not by judges. He's very good at determining that, and understanding the political environment, as we'll see, is important in states as well. So what about Chief Justice selection? Here's where we get into the heart of this research. If we're going to study how Chief Justices are chosen, and if they are chosen for these particular leadership qualities, we have to then dive in to how the states choose their justices. Here's where we run into our first real problem. Different states choose their Chief Justices in different ways. And it's useless to look at Chief Justice selection if they are chosen in a way that in no way looks towards leadership qualities. I mean, let's be very honest. Some states select their Chief Justices by the popular vote. And it is very well known that most voters don't know anything about what they're voting about when they get into the voting booth. They choose somebody because they have a D or an R next to their name, or because they're at the top of the list. That's what happens. People are not taking into account why they are chosen to be, or they're not considering the possible leadership skills of the people they're putting in this office. But there is one method of selection where this could be taken into account. It's currently 20 states, so it's the most used system of choosing the Chief Justice. There are 20 states where the justices themselves choose their chief justice. So if our overarching question is, do leadership characteristics of women, are they important? And an explanation as to why women are becoming chief justices at a greater rate than in other positions of political power. This is an area where we might be able to determine it, where these characteristics are actually taken into account by strategic, thoughtful individuals who really care about the outcome of who is going to be the Chief Justice. So, getting into this, there is one very important piece of literature that really for lack of a better term, we kind of piggyback off of for parts of it, but we're also we also separate ourselves from this work as well. It's a piece by Laura Langer and a couple of other of her associates, written in 2003. She was really the first to explore Chief Justice selection. She wasn't looking at it from any kind of gender point of view, but she was just looking at why, what can explain the emergence of some people as Chief Justice over others. And in her research, her theoretical basis starts with looking at the goals of the justices who choose their Chief Justice. And they conclude that the justices, when deciding who they're going to choose as their Chief Justice, they pursue either personal or institutional goals. And there's a real important nuance here. I pointed this out earlier. It all has to do with opinion assignment. They conclude that opinion assignment is really important as to the motivating factors for why different associate judges choose a Chief Justice. They conclude, and they do find evidence for, that when the Chief Justice has the power of opinion assignment, the justices pursue personal goals. What are personal goals? This is merely the desire to see policy shaped in a way that you like. So if you are on a court and you are, say, an ardent conservative state Supreme Court associate justice, and your Chief Justice has the power of opinion assignment, you want a justice that is like-minded like you, another conservative, to be Chief Justice. Why? Because they will then be able to hand out opinions, hopefully to you and to other colleagues who are like you, so that you can shape policy through the courts in the way that you would like to see it shaped. But what happens where states don't allow their Chief Justice to assign opinions? They say here this involves institutional goals. When the Chief Justice cannot assign opinions, what the justices look towards is more outward. They look to their environment. When the Chief Justice can't assign opinions, they want to put a Chief Justice, or put a person into the Chief Justiceship who's going to promote the interests of the court and the larger political environment, particularly to the state's legislature. That's going to be a good face for the court. Institutional goals, pursuing that institutional maintenance that I talked about. We posit, to build onto this, we say that, okay, well, they're choosing this, they are also looking for particular characteristics, leadership characteristics of the Chief Justices that they select, and that the differences, or that the leadership characteristics and qualities that the literature on gender and leadership talks about are taken into account. This leads us to really the theoretical part of our paper. Since this hasn't been explored before, we really don't have a true theoretical basis. So we come up really with rivaling theoretical explanations, and the crux of the paper is to see which one might be right. So our first explanation is what we call our women's leadership explanation of female Chief Justice selection. This is grounded in the literature on leadership styles, that men and women lead in different ways. To summarize it very briefly, women are seen as being more democratic leaders. They want to foster consensus. They lead, or are seen as being more successful in flatter organizations. Their leadership style is more democratic and inclusive. They don't want to leave people out. Male leadership, on the other side, is seen as more authoritarian. It works better in more hierarchical structures, where male leaders prefer to be able to make the executive decision. their leadership styles are more successful in those types of organizations. Well, when you look at that, and you look at courts organizationally resemble the types of organizations that women would be successful in. They are flatter. Chief justices are always considered to be what they call the first, or the first among equals, meaning that they are no different than their peers. They just happen to have to fulfill this administrative, organizational leadership role. But when it comes to deciding cases, they are no different than everyone else. This is an organization that would seem amenable to female leadership and to the leadership qualities that the psychological and business and organizational literature talk about with women. This has also been used in literature, a growing literature in political science. Christina Boyd, who's a judicial scholar down in University of Georgia, has done some research in this area on federal district courts and does find evidence for this proposition and leadership styles as well. So when we're applying this in political science, we're not going out on a complete limb. There has actually been some evidence done in a different court setting that does find that does lend support to where we're going. And the real crux that we are interested in, though, for the long term and for this paper, is this idea of consensus. Consensus is very important on courts, and according to the literature on women's leadership, consensus is an integral part of women's leadership. So again, an explanation for why there might be more female state Supreme Court Chief Justices, why they've had more success at filling this position. So where does this lead us? From this theoretical explanation, we come up with several hypotheses that are tested in this paper. We posit that women are going to be more likely to be selected when there are more ideological disparities on the court. Why? Because women, if they are consensual leaders, will be better able to provide consensus when there is this type of ideological divergence on the court. If there is too much dissensus, then the court could become very, the justices could have very hard working relations with one another. They might not be able to come to solid conclusions of law. It can muddy precedent. It makes it hard for the legal system in the state to operate. The job of the courts is to provide guidance, and if there is no guidance given from the court, they don't know where to turn. If women's leadership is in fact real and is accurate, then this is we expect to see that this the emergence of female chief justices in these types of environments. We also expect to see that women will be selected when there are disparities in the ideological distances between the courts and other branches of government. So from the legislature and the courts, or maybe the governor's office and the courts. And we also will say throughout these, we're going to say we also say that the effective opinion assignment is going to be very important. Might have a conditioning effect on these on the emergence of a female chief justice. But we really didn't really know at the onset the direction of how opinion assignment would affect the selection of a female chief justice. Our alternative explanation is what we call a supply side explanation of female chief justice emergence. And it's a very fancy way of explaining a very mundane point. There are just more women justices on state Supreme Courts now. So the probability of a woman being emerging as a chief justice is just higher than it was in 1990 or 1980 or 1970. There's just more of them. But there are underlying reasons why there are more women in state Supreme Courts. On this explanation, we draw from a vast literature on descriptive representation. The idea that our political institutions need to look more like the populations that they represent. Women make up half the population. There should be, according to those who study descriptive representation, half of the legislature should be female. Half of the court should be, the members of court should be female. And then you can divide this down to, other types of minorities. They should be represented descriptively as well. And there are reasons why this is desirable. This research in political science shows that differing viewpoints help aid in decision making. decision making is never good when it comes from one point of view. Differing points of view help us make different decisions, and differing viewpoints should help to make better decisions on courts or in legislatures or elsewhere. And different states have at times, depending on their political cultures, emphasized this belief in descriptive representation, that it is good for state government. It provides a sense of, it provides legitimacy in the decisions that we make. The result of this literature and our explanation is that simply as states believe in this and put their belief into action, more and more women are chosen as associate justices, and then because there's just a greater pool or a greater supply, there's just going to be more women chief justices as well. And to this end, descriptive representation is just seen as an end in and of itself. Women aren't chosen as chief justices because they might be good at building consensus or might have a very inclusive and democratic leadership style. They're just choosing to be chief justice because they're women. So this is where again, in this first paper, which I'm going through here, these are the explanations we kind of bring to the table. Here are some of the hypotheses that we form out of this. Women will be selected when there are more women on the court. Particularly women who are more senior members of the court will be more likely to be chosen as a chief justice compared to male colleagues. Women will be more likely to be selected when descriptive representation is a goal of the state. Some states could care less about whether or not there are women in the courts or in legislatures or elsewhere, but other ones do. Other ones, again, see it as an end in and of itself. So, where do we go from here? Our analysis involves the selection of chief justices in the states where the justices choose their own chief justices from 1970 to 2010. Again, we only use these states. Future research, as we'll see, we want to look at selection mechanisms in other states, but this is what we choose. Our dependent variable in this analysis is a state year dyad. The years when a state is at risk of choosing a new chief justice. And what we mean is by at risk, it means that a new chief justice is going to be selected to the position. And then is it going to be a woman or is it going to be a man? And what is at interest here is the time between when different states choose their chief justice and whether or not there is a male or female chief justice that emerges and becomes the chief justice in that state. And in our analysis, because time is a factor, and like I said, what is at play is at time, and again, what's called the risk of emergence, or you could also rephrase it as the emergence of a candidate. We use what's called a Cox proportional hazards model. We tried other time variant models as well, but the results were pretty much the same, so we just went with the old standby that's used in this type of data analysis. To estimate our models. This is just an idea of some of the independent variables we have in our model. We measure the state court ideological median. We also study the range of opinions on the court. So we use we measure the standard deviation of the courts from their median to find out how much diversity there is ideologically on the court. We also use a range of ideology to measure political polarization on state Supreme Courts, which proved to be pretty important. We also measure distances between the state courts and other elites. We also measure distances between the state courts and their citizens. We accounted for our descriptive representation argument, whether or not there was a female governor. We measured the number of women on the court and the seniority of women on the court as well. Among others, we had other control variables, but those are really the variables that are of interest to us in this model. And to spare you the tables, I'll just go through what we find, what was significant and what was insignificant. Well, we found out that ideological diversity was important. Ideological range was insignificant, but we ran a second model where it does become significant, and I'll explain that in my conclusion. It leads to an interesting conclusion to this paper. What we really find the biggest support, though, for is the number of women and for seniority. We also found that we also accounted for who was president at the time, and we find a very top-down effect. When there is a Democratic president, there is kind of a trickle-down effect of that president into state politics, and we see more women emerging as Chief Justice when there are Democratic presidents. We also find significance for term length and opinion assignment, which are also pretty important, and I'll explain those in a second. I'll get to range in a second. What we also find that's insignificant, and it is important, that the distance that the court is from other branches of government is unimportant, and it also doesn't matter whether or not the court is close to its population or distant to its population ideologically. Which again, we didn't really explore that in too much detail afterward, but it could be explored in future research. Here are some graphs of our results where we hold different important variables at their means and medians, and then test over time how they change. This is again the best explanatory variable in this, and this is just the emergence of the fact that there being more women over time. You can see over time, especially at the beginning about 2003, 2004, there's an exponential increase in the number of women who were chosen as Chief Justice, and this does coincide with just more women being on state Supreme Courts. And we varied this over the standard deviation of the number of women that are on the bench, and you can see that whether it's above or below, that's kind of hard to see with the lines that are on there. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Beginning in that time, how if there's fewer or more, there are just more women emerging as Chief Justice in those states. Other important findings here. This has to do with the median, as you will see when there's greater diversity on the courts. This is the median, but as diversity increases ideologically, the exponential increase in the likelihood of a woman emerging as Chief Justice really accelerates beginning after 2000, really about 2003. This is a very important conclusion. It has to do with opinion assignment. And we see here that while on both whether or not the state does or does not, this is when they do assign, the Chief Justice does assign opinion. Here's where they do not. We see that they both increase exponentially over time, but it's especially true in the states where women do not have the power to assign court opinions. And I'll talk about that in my conclusion, what that means. This one has to do with the seniority of women on the bench. It's not nearly as important as this explanation, but we do see that as more and more women become senior members on the bench, the likelihood of them emerging as a Chief Justice in their states increases exponentially. So, what do we conclude here? First of all, we find a little bit of both, supporting both explanations. We see that when there is divergence ideologically on the court, we see that there is the likelihood of a female emerging as the Chief Justice increases. But the nuance with this has to do with the difference, like I said, between ideological diversity and ideological polarization. When there is a diversity of opinions across the board, there is more likely to be, the likelihood of a female Chief Justice emerging increases. But as the courts become more polarized from one another, they actually, the likelihood decreases. We didn't find a significant effect there, but they do decrease, which leads us to, we conclude, we don't have evidence for, but we would like to explore in the future whether how gender might play into this polarization. Are women seen as being in these political environments polarizing in and of themselves, or are they seen as being unable to handle a polarized judicial environment? What else do we find? On the supply side, this is where we find our strongest evidence. The number of women that are available and the seniority of women on the courts really plays a key role in understanding the emergence of female Chief Justices on the state Supreme Courts. And political context proved to be fairly insignificant, at least as far as we were measuring it. Whether or not the court is ideologically proximate or not proximate to other branches of government or to the citizenry is really irrelevant for the emergence here. We want to maybe dive into a little more of that in the future. And then, very importantly, the nuance that we find of term length and opinion assignment. We find that term length is very, the states with longer term lengths for their Chief Justice, women are more likely to emerge as Chief Justice than in smaller, or states have a shorter length of time where you serve as Chief Justice. And this is important in the sense that it shows that these justices are not afraid that they are going to have female Chief Justices over time, that they're afraid that their leadership is going to be in some way bad or that they won't be, that it'll be bad for the court. And as I will explain in a second, we have anecdotal evidence that this is a very important variable in our model. But what is very interesting is this idea of opinion assignment. While states are not afraid, or state Supreme Courts are not afraid to have women as their Chief Justices, why aren't women emerging as Chief Justices in the states where Chief Justices have this very real power, this power that when we study the United States Supreme Court is seen as being the greatest power that the Chief Justice has? In this way, we're wondering whether or not this is the fulfilling of the token member that we see in a long line of research on women in courts. It looks great. They've got maybe these people are putting their these women in this position, and they look good on paper, but they have no real authority or no ability to wield authority in their position because they don't control the outcomes of the cases themselves. And this, in a way, leads to some future research that we're getting into. There's one very big, and we very easily recognize this weakness in our research. This paper is in the final processes of publication, but before we did that, we had to address some serious concerns, and I'm aware of this. My co-author, I'm working with multiple co-authors, but who I'm working with here, we have kind of a very ordering of research papers that we want to perform out of this, and we skipped. We skipped from 1 straight to number 2, and we recognized this. We made a very deep assumption that justices care at all about the leadership qualities of not just of women and men, but of their Chief Justices in particular. It's one thing to, in political science research, we do have to make some assumptions. But this is a big assumption, and we don't, in fact, know that they take these qualities into account. So we're aware of this, but this is in part related to where our next avenue of research is going. I have this current research project number 1. I am in the midst of a grant-funded project where I'm submitting surveys to current and previous state Supreme Court justices, those who have been Chief Justices, those who haven't. 323 current state justices, 230 former state justices, so I have 561. If I can get 20% of them to respond back to me, that would be great. But I don't know if that will happen. But what I'm doing is I'm asking them just that. Do you look for, or do you hope to have requisite skills in your Chief Justice? What do you think are the best skills that your Chief Justice can have? What do you see as being their most important jobs? If you were Chief Justice, what did you find to be the hardest part of the job? What did you think was most important for you? There has been some work. I've worked with a gentleman who's down in Louisiana, Lafayette, who did a similar survey. And in his survey, they came back and the justices themselves said over and over again, consensus, consensus, consensus. This is what's important on our courts. He didn't ask it from the position of the Chief Justice, but the justices said it over and over and over again. And like I said, to that end, I do have anecdotal evidence that this is important. I talked directly with a South Carolina Supreme Court justice a couple of months ago. And I asked her, she wanted to know about my project and what this was. I said, well, I'm doing this. And the first thing out of her mouth, it's all about consensus. She said, it's all about consensus. She also qualified it by saying it's also a matter of term length. Because in some states, the term lengths are so short that you don't really have a chance to, as the Chief Justice, to try to make your mark on the court, which is kind of important. She said it would be consensus, but I would also account for the length of term that they have, which also feeds back to our results that we just had. women are more likely to emerge in positions where they have longer term limits. So there is another puzzle that we'll try to tie together. But this survey is really designed to tap into that idea of consensus. This will also, I should also preface, in this analysis that I just did, I'm only looking at the states where the justices choose their chief justice. The survey I'm administering will also allow us to tap into some of the underlying attitudes among the justices from other selection systems, where their chief justice is chosen via popular election, whether they are nominated and confirmed like they are at the federal level, or whether in some states they just emerge because of seniority. In some states they just do seniority cycles, or they just do cycling altogether. You're the next person in line, you become chief justice, and then the next person comes in and they're chief justice. There are, again, a multitude of ways in which they're chosen. And this will hopefully tap into these different selection methods and see if there are similarities across different selection methods. Another project we're also working on, and this will be done after the survey, is do female chief justices actually exhibit leadership qualities that we're addressing here? Mainly the idea of consensus. What we're doing, I'm working on this also with other co-authors because we actually need slave labor to produce this data. We are actually slowly gathering data on consensus in state Supreme Courts over time. We're using that same time window and moving it forward, and we're trying to get a good sample of cases across all 50 states to see how consensual norms are in state Supreme Courts. This is a massive undertaking. And again, this is a very long-term project that we're looking to find money for, to pay the people to help us code this data. But we want to see whether or not consensual norms fluctuate depending on the gender of the Chief Justice. And of course, other factors. It's not a panacea. We're not saying that consensus dissipates as soon as men are Chief Justices. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that there are different leadership qualities that have a role to play in why courts are and are not consensual in their decision making. Other research opportunities, again, this has been a very fruitful tree. As I've worked on my own with this and with my co-author in this paper and with other people, we just keep asking, it seems to generate more questions, which is always good. You always like to have more questions to answer. So this is just a trickle of some of the information that we have. This is what is the effect of female leadership on courts for descriptive representation in general and institutional legitimacy? I've been thinking actually about this question this morning while I was shaving and getting ready to come here. I think back to different states where in reality, in the eyes of the public, female chief justices have actually been scapegoated in different states. For example, when Iowa, when their court decided that in Iowa gay marriage was constitutional under the Iowa Constitution, who was scapegoated for that decision? Their female chief justice, who then lost her re-election bid. In the state of Tennessee, while I was there was a very controversial capital punishment case decided where for the first time in forever, a person who was sentenced to death, their sentence was reduced by the Supreme Court, or they were given a stay. And what happened? Who was to blame for that? The female chief justice of that state court, who then lost a retention election in the upcoming election. So there are many ways. I have yet to sort any of that out, but that's again an idea I've got that might come out of this research. And again, other selection contexts and the role that they play in female chief justice emergence and tying that into legitimacy as well. That's all I have.
Lee Stewart, who was the chairman of our department from 1960 to 1974. The lectureship started while he was chair, and then after he moved on, I don't know if you'd say to greater things.